Again, we've talked about change management. If we're going to do this, we want to make sure that we are clear of as to what we are tracking changes around. Commonly, things like servers make for great things that we would track change around to maintain availability. We may want to track different attributes. Some attributes related to an asset that we could track, well, the asset owner, the location of the asset, version numbers, IP addresses, and so on. With change management, using it consistently, as we've said for so many other topics, is crucial. We need to make sure that we are doing this in a way that is consistent. To consider changes and whether or not we approve them, we typically have a change management board. And the change management board has representatives from the business, ideally people who can look at the implications to them as teams, a management representative to own the outcome, to ultimately make the decision. Security, of course, in terms of any security implications, technical teams, and maybe even legal counsel. Do we need legal counsel? It's becoming increasingly common. So legal counsel is becoming increasingly common because of some of the regulatory requirements around things like privacy. Making sure that we know that we've got the right people involved is important. And the right people will change between organizations. What's right for your organization is probably not the same as what is right for a different organization. And there's no hard right and wrong. So that representation is commonly what we would see. Some organizations have HR present, finance, and so on. So we want to know that a change that's proposed is considered in terms of its impact. What is the benefit versus the risk? How do we know if a change is worthwhile? And again, this is risk-based typically. Some organizations will see a critical security update and not apply it. Why? Well, potentially because the critical update could have an impact on live operations that the company thinks is a worse outcome or a potential worse outcome than the benefit brought by the security update. So again, this is risk-based. How do we know if a change is successful? Really good question. And increasingly, you will see mature organizations not relying on technical teams for this. If you update a business system and the technical team says the server is back up and running, we can see the login screen. Does that mean that the system is running correctly? Absolutely not. What we want to do is to check that that change is successful by using the system. And typically the people able to check that the change is effective are the business representatives, those business units. If it's their system and they use these processes within the system, good advice is, or best practice is to ask them to check that the system is working correctly. So the change management board will typically consider approving a change. They're looking at that benefit versus the potential risk. Any impact. Updating can take systems offline, for example. It's not just about the risk of the update not working correctly. It can be the impact of the update itself. Timing. When do we do this? When is going to cause least disruption? Any interdependencies, any contractual issues, if we're a supplier or we're being supplied with services. Communications, absolutely crucial. As we said in chapter 2, communications is the thing we often do least well. And it's something that we take for granted. We assume we will get it right. It needs very clear thinking. Logging and post-implementation review, checking what has worked, what hasn't worked. And as part of that approval process, typically what we are looking for is some sort of plan for what we can do if the change is unsuccessful. We apply the change, we update some software, for example. What do we do if that change creates an outage, if it doesn't work? Can we roll back? And snapshots and backups are a couple of ways there that we could roll back. But importantly, that is usually part of the consideration as to whether to approve a change or not. What do we do if it doesn't work? Whatever our learning should form part of our continuous improvement cycle as well. Privacy policy, another form of documentation we would expect to have, states effectively how we're going to manage private data, privacy data. Financial impact, reputation, these are the whys we're doing it. We could say the impact to the organization is that we could go bust. We could go bankrupt if we don't do this well. We want a good, clear statement on our approach. And again, we've talked already about the regulatory issues, managing breaches and compliance. With GDPR, for example, you have 72 hours to report an information breach, and you can be fined 2 to 4% of your global turnover. Understanding what data we hold, and as we said, any regulatory requirements is absolutely essential. You cannot be compliant from a regulatory position unless you know what the requirements are for the data that you hold. It's why that information asset register is so important. It documents what you have, and you can start to plan your compliance. And again, just a broad statement about jurisdictions. Your privacy policy may well reflect the fact that you have different requirements across different jurisdictions. For example, if you operate in South America and you operate in the Asia Pacific region, your two approaches might be different for those two very broad regions, or even for territories within those regions. With privacy, we mentioned some of these roles already. Let's just give a quick reminder. We want to allocate somebody for any private data, especially personally identifiable information. We want somebody to be accountable. This is the key word for the data owner or the data controller, the person acting as the owner. They're not the true owner. The data subject is the true owner. If I have healthcare information that is collected by a company, it is my data. I am the data subject. In theory, I am in control. However, when it's collected, let's say by a hospital, there needs to be somebody who is going to act as the owner within the hospital, within the organization. A better term, a better description is the data controller. They're controlling what happens within that healthcare institution. And we think of the data owner or the data controller as being accountable. If there is a fine, the fine typically goes to the data owner or the data controller. We have the data processor. The data processor is typically the person using the data. This could be a cloud service provider. If you've got cloud email, they're processing your data. The person using your data, also processing your data. Now, from a regulatory standpoint, the data processor is usually considered not to be accountable. The data processor is considered to be responsible. If there is a fine, if the data processor is negligent, usually the data owner or controller is fined. So the data owner or controller needs to be very careful about who they are choosing as a cloud service provider, for example, or who they are asking to process the data. And this needs to be really tightly contracted. Any consequential damage, if the processor does something that creates a liability issue, that creates a privacy issue that results in a fine, it is the data owner or controller typically that will be the recipient of the fine. So they protect themselves through the use of a contract. And again, just be very aware of geography and jurisdictions, as we've said throughout the course.